and welcome to another video, and welcome to an introduction video for the next book in the Thomas Hardy Read-Along that we will be reading in February, and that book is Two on a Tower. This is Thomas Hardy's 9th book, which means we've got 6 more to go, including this one. Now, in these videos, what I'm going to do is not really give you a huge amount of information about the book, and this is also not a review. This is just an introduction to the book to give you a sense of the kind of book that it is and what you're letting yourself in for if you want to read along. All of the details about the read along are in the description box below. We have, like I said, been reading now for quite a while. We're up to book 9, but you can join in any time with any book. You can go back to the beginning and start again if you want. You can jump around, or you can just start with this one, which would be a fun place to start, I guess. But yeah, if you want to join in, all of the details are in the description box below. This book, like most Thomas Hardy books to this point, was serialised. This one was serialised in Atlantic Monthly, and it was serialised from May to December in 1882. It was then published as a 3-volume novel at the end. I think it was about December of that same year as well. Now, in Thomas Hardy's preface for the 1895 edition of this book, he set out his intention for the book, which I just want to read you because I think it's a really good summary of kind of what his intention was going into it and what you can kind of expect. So he said, this slightly built romance was the outcome of a wish to set the emotional history of 2 infinitesimal lives against the stupendous background of the stellar universe, and to impart to readers the sentiment that of these contrasting magnitudes, the smaller might be the greater to them as men. So the very vague plot is that we have a character called Swithin St. Cleeve. He's a young man and he is an astronomer, and he asks a landowner if he can use the tower that's on their land in order to set up his telescope to look at the stars, and he is very much obsessed with that, to kind of the exclusion of what on earth is actually going on around him. He spends more time looking at the stars than he does paying attention to the people around him. The landowner is a lady by the name of Lady Vivette Constantine. Now, she is married, and her husband, who is awful, is away in Africa, and she hopes that he won't return because, well, he's awful. And she also then falls in love with the astronomer. This is a Thomas Hardy romance without a love triangle. I mean, she is married, but she very much doesn't like her husband, and it seems like he doesn't like her either. So there isn't really a love triangle in this, which is very unusual with Thomas Hardy at this point, but it is very, very much a romance. So as with all of these videos, what I like to do is tell you a little bit about the reception of the book when it was first released. And I have some quotes from some contemporary reviews. They're quite interesting, I think you'll probably agree. So the first review that I found said, Mr. Hardy's previous novel, A Laodicean, which we read in January, can hardly have been thought an improvement on the previous works by which he delighted so many readers and made for himself so just a fame as a novelist. And unfortunately, it is not easy to think that Two on a Tower is much of an improvement on A Laodicean. Now, if you've read A Laodicean with us in January, that might fill you with some dread, because I think a lot of people haven't loved it. So if reviewers thought A Two on a Tower wasn't much of an improvement, well, okay. Other reviews said the story is far too full of minor incidents which really have nothing to do with the action, and they described it as extremely disappointing. Another review said, this is a story as unpleasant as it is practically impossible. There is not, from beginning to end, a single gleam of probability in the plot, and what good end can be served by violating all natural motives in order to produce such unpleasant results, we are at a loss to see. It goes on to say, the book as a whole is bad, the worst the author has written. Now, every time Thomas Hardy released a book which wasn't as good as some of his previous ones, a reviewer would say, it's the worst yet. No exception with this one. It's the worst yet, according to some reviewers. I can't actually say very much without spoiling the plot. There are elements within it that the reading public found, frankly, scandalous and shocking. Now, Hardy himself said that many critics would contact him privately to say that they loved what he was trying to do, and they loved the themes and the slightly scandalous things that he was talking about. But those same critics publicly completely trashed the novel. So they said very different things behind closed doors, or in closed letters, shall we say. But Hardy definitely seems to have been aware of the criticism, so he definitely read his own reviews. There are, as far as I know, no film or TV adaptations of Two on a Tower. There are many great audiobooks. The audiobook that I found, I think it's actually one that was created by Audible, but I actually got it from my library, so I think maybe the licensing was, maybe it was created by Audible and they licensed it to a library, but it's narrated by Michael Kitchen, which is fantastic, and he does a really, really great job. So that's the one. If you can get hold of it, I recommend that one as well. But please do let me know if you know of any great audiobooks that you would like to recommend other people, and drop those suggestions in the comments so that other people can read it as well. But the last thing to talk about is the misery scale. And this is where I just have to pause for a moment and we just have to have a little chat. So the misery scale is something which, if you're new, is something that I've been doing just to apply a kind of really vague number to a Thomas Hardy book to give you an indication of what kind of misery you can be expecting. For me, as a huge Thomas Hardy fan, one of the first things that people often say to me when I say I love Thomas Hardy is, oh, but his books are so miserable. And I'm always trying to push against that. I'm always trying to say, no, actually, not all of his books are miserable. There are some books that are actually incredibly light. There are some books that are, well, supposed to be funny. Whether they actually are is another thing, but there is a lot of lightness in the books. And I think also for me, this is just a personal thing, but when I think of misery, I think of a book that is overall in its vibe miserable, where nothing good happens, where like bad thing after bad thing happens and it's just like wall-to-wall misery. Some of Hardy's books are very much like that. But when books just have maybe one or two sad things happening, if the overall kind of vibe of the book isn't miserable, I don't necessarily see that as being a miserable book. That's why I think there has been some disagreement about my misery scores, and you're very welcome to disagree with me. But that's why there has been a disagreement, because sometimes I rate a book quite low on the misery scale because I personally don't find it miserable as a kind of overall kind of vibe of the book. Whereas other people, you know, when miserable things happen, if it's just one or two things, that sets the tone for the whole book for them. And that's completely fair, I think. So it is quite difficult to give an arbitrary score, and this is just completely arbitrary. So it is just how I personally view Thomas Hardy's books in terms of the overall misery you might feel having read the book, how that sits compared to other Thomas Hardy novels. So having said all that, it is quite difficult, I think, to give a score for Two on a Tower. If you've read it, you might know why. But without spoiling something that happens toward the end of the book, which I think does kind of overall change your feeling. When I first read Two on a Tower, I thought it was actually quite low on the misery scale. I mean, I didn't have this scale in my head when I first read it, but my sense afterwards was that it wasn't that miserable. And I think I got that sense from just kind of, yes, the whole book has a kind of melancholy about it and a kind of almost an emo-ness to it, but I didn't think that kind of lent itself to a kind of a misery, kind of a miserableness, basically. Except something happens later in the book, which is quite miserable. And that, for me, when I first read it, didn't really affect my kind of overall feeling of the book. I didn't think it was, I wouldn't have lumped it back then with Thomas Hardy's most miserable. But I gave this book to my sister to read. Now, my sister is not a big reader. She finds, for a number of reasons, reading kind of prose fiction quite challenging. But I had read the book and loved it, so she said, oh, I might read it. And that was maybe about 15 years ago, and she is still to this day not forgiven me and won't let me forget it. And she still remembers the ending, and she still refers to it as one of the most miserable books she's ever read. So that kind of makes me realise that my perspective, because I do read a lot of miserable books, it's probably very different from most people. So with all of those caveats, we're eventually going to get to a score, aren't we? I'm going to give Two on a Tower on the misery scale 4. It puts it quite high up there with some of the other much more miserable Thomas Hardy books. I personally quite like Two on a Tower. I know lots of the contemporary critics didn't like it. I know lots of people who have read it in the last few decades don't rate it as highly as his other books, but I actually quite like it. It has its faults, it has some issues, but overall I quite liked it. I will save all of my thoughts for when I do hopefully a recap video of my experience rereading it this time and everyone else's as well. So that's my quick introduction to Two on a Tower. If you are joining in reading with us, do let me know in the comments. If you've read it before, obviously let me know as well. If you're going to be rereading it or skipping this one, or what you thought of it. You can come over to the Discord. You can send me a comment on Patreon,
All of the links to all of the things for the read along are in the description box below, and I will see you very soon in another video. Thank you so much for watching.